do we as a nation believe in that those who make more should pay a little more, so that those who make less can work their way up the ladder and eventually be those who pay a little more, which is exactly my case. And we're also, the way I was raised was we were a group that always wanted the next generation to be more successful than we were. I would argue that it's a huge cultural shift if we make the decision that we're just going to screw our kids, because we're having fun. And the baby boomers will go down in history as the people who started changing the direction of the culture of this nation, which is we don't care about our children. That pains me. I don't want my children to have this debt that theoretically I'm part of running up, or maybe more than theoretically. And so watching it from a sort of scientific viewpoint, not from an emotional one, is going to be interesting. If we make that decision, I think we've altered the culture of this country.
Well, I think that's right. And look how we're doing it. The way that we've run up this deficit in terms of not collecting the tax that needs to be collected to pay for current expenses is we have actually created an enormous federal spending program that's administered. Some people like to say it's administered by the IRS. I don't think so. It's administered by TurboTax and H&R Block and individuals filling out their tax returns. If you want to put solar panels on your house, you get a tax credit for it. Nobody asks if it was a smart decision, if it was whether the panels are really effective, whether you've actually cut your consumption or anything like that. If you want to buy a vacation home, you can get a mortgage and deduct the interest for your vacation home. Nobody asks whether it's a needed thing, whether that community needs more housing in it or any of those kinds of questions. And if a corporation wants to invest in machinery, it gets accelerated depreciation for that. Nobody says, well, is that a kind of machinery that we'd like to subsidize by allowing the write-off early? So we've got this spending going on. And unlike direct government spending, it's very hard to cut. We're living in a world with a sequester where they're just lopping off federal spending with a knife. And they're just saying people are going on furlough. Well, you can't put my mortgage interest deduction on furlough. And you can't put accelerated depreciation on furlough. And so the real challenge we have is how do we take that enormous spending program, which is over $1 trillion a year, that's run through the tax system, and begin to cut that? Can we this is going to sound crazy from the simplification point of view, but do we have some kind of an add-on minimum tax where we say, take all these benefits you have and pay part of it back? We're going to sequester your mortgage interest deduction by just taking 10% of the value of it and adding that back to your tax. That's one of the proposals actually we have seen floated around to say limit the value of itemized deductions to 28%. Well, that's just saying to high-income people, we're going to sequester your itemized deductions to the extent that they're over 28%. But we've got to find a way to put a handle on that tax-oriented spending. It's going to be very hard to do. What would you say to the White House? What would you say to Congress? Do you have some advice how to get them on track, how to move from the starting to start to really making progress here?
For me, the initiative would come from the White House. So my advice would be, you've got really, really smart people up on the Hill. You've got really, really smart people in the Treasury Department. You're one of them. I think it requires for me presidential leadership, again with the caveat that I go back to the '86 Act. I was very young and idealistic, and I thought they did a relatively good job, and have Treasury design a new income tax system in a sequester, so to speak, behind closed doors. No politicians. Bring in the top economists.
The CEO of Tax Analysts just suggests that something be done behind closed doors?
Yes. To start, absolutely. And as you point out, we believe in transparency. But just put them in a room and let them design a system and then bring it out and say, this is what we think you should do, just like we did in '84, and then let the politicians take a crack at it. I like your soup to nuts plan. And I think it should come from the White House. I think that's where you're the most powerful person in the free world. You could at least start tax reform, I would think. And you get them and you protect them from the political influence for a while, and then have them design a system, soup to nuts, and come out and say, this is what I propose. Now let's talk about it.
You know, that answer suggests that it would be in the political interest of a president, this president or a future president, to work on reforming the tax system. And it really raises the question of whether this president should be doing that, if it fits within his priorities. I mean, to start a conversation about tax reform is to drop a conversation about something else. Are you going to no longer have a conversation about immigration? You know, are you no longer going to have a conversation about health care? You know, what conversation we need to have? And it really begs the political question, is tax reform important to ordinary voters? I know it's important to the business community, and they're investing a lot in it. And I know it's very important to conservatives who are investing a lot in it. But I'm not sure that it's an issue that moves ordinary voters. And so maybe it's not ripe. And that would lead to the advice I'd give Congress, which is to move from starting to start, to move to something that looks more like a start. We need to see from the leadership of the Ways and Means Committee and the leadership of the Finance Committee those kinds of big, full bills that we saw from Bradley Gephardt and Kemp Kasten in the 80s. And maybe it can't be the chairman. Maybe it's got to be somebody who comes from a very, very safe district, who's just an extraordinarily popular person, who can afford the risk of putting out a bill that says we're going to limit mortgage interest deductions. You know, that's not a bill that somebody who represents, you know, coastal North Carolina can put out because they've got a lot of vacation homes down there. But there's got to be somebody who can step forward and say, I can have the big idea. I'm late enough in my career, I'm safe enough in my seat, whatever it is, that I can begin this conversation. So I think my advice to Congress is they've got to start, if you will, plowing the ground, so, you know, getting it ready for planning a real tax reform discussion. And then maybe the next president will be in a political position where he or she's willing to invest in that kind of an operation.
I think that's right. I mean, as we both pointed out, the president gets to decide. It's his prerogative what is important to him and what isn't. And one of the reasons I don't give tax reform a lot of chance in the next couple of years is clearly this president says tax reform is not important to me, and that's fine. He gets to do that. He's the president. The second thing that when you were talking triggered a thought in my head that part of leadership to me for the next president, and if the ground is blazed, and maybe the Finance Committee and the Ways and Means Committee are blazing it, again we go back to Europe, maybe they've started to start, part of leadership to me would be convincing the American people that this is a big enough problem that it requires reform, whatever that means at this time. And I don't think we have that leadership right now. Maybe we will in a couple of years.